we get out of here tonight, Jenny,
That's a good word, Council.
we have an emergency item added,
I'd like to call this meeting to order, the Woodland Davis Clean Water Agency. All board members are in attendance. We have a substitute member for UC Davis. That's David Phillips, the Director of Utilities at UC Davis. Sid England could not be here today. I want to welcome the audience and let the minutes show that all members of the board are present, with that exception that I noted. Do we have any changes to the meeting agenda? Seeing none. Do we need a motion for that? We don't. Okay. The public comment. This is an opportunity for the public to comment on any items that are not appearing on the agenda. You will have an opportunity to comment on specific items that are on the agenda. Do we have any public comment? Seeing none, we'll move to item 4. I want to welcome Mr. Ken Landau here, the Assistant Executive Officer of the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. I don't know how they came up with such a long name. Some of us, it took years to get that name down, but we welcome you here. And Eric, do you want to introduce that item?
Yes, thank you. I have a prepared statement because there's a number of points that I wanted to make before Mr. Landau addresses the board. There has been a lot of discussion recently about the timing of and need for the water supply project. As you know, the cities concluded in 2008 that a regional surface water supply project is the least costly and most environmentally friendly way to meet current and future anticipated water quality regulations, both for drinking water and wastewater discharges. This project was developed after decades of water supply planning, an exhaustive review of alternatives, reviews by 2 independent bodies, and consideration of water quality mandates imposed by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. The surface water supply project is expensive, and it does have significant impact on rates. So it is understandable that our community has questions about whether or not the project is a must-do. The connection between this project, which will greatly improve water quality and water supply reliability, and wastewater discharge permit requirements is being challenged. We have made it known that this project will help us reduce salinity and other contaminants of concern in our wastewater discharges, which is a requirement of our respective wastewater discharge permits. Some in our communities are speculating that the Regional Water Quality Control Board will ease restrictions on constituents in wastewater discharges, most notably salinity, leading them to conclude that our project is unnecessary or can be delayed for a significant time period. Further, a recent court decision involving the City of Tracy requires the Regional Water Quality Control Board to consider economic impact when establishing permit requirements. This is further being cited as a reason the cities can delay the project based on the impact to rates. Finally, there have been recent media reports and online commentary that have confused an already complicated set of issues. There is a growing perception that we have decades to comply with current standards, that current standards are likely to be relaxed, and that it would be cheaper to pay the fines than to implement the project. To address many of these issues, we've asked Mr. Landau here, and we really appreciate his attendance. And I just turn it back to the board if any questions you have.
Good. Thank you very much, Eric. And Mr. Landau, if you'd like to come on forward to the microphone, we've got some questions we'd like to ask you, and if you have anything you'd like to say before we start those questions, that's fine, or I can launch right into.
Well, I would like to introduce Diana Messina. Diana is supervising engineer handling the NPDES discharges, which are discharges of surface water, and she works directly with Davis Woodland, UC Davis, and dischargers from basically Stanislaus County up through, up toward Butte County. And I handle with the agency at this point the surface water discharges, the few million acres of irrigated lands, TMDLs that are setting standards, basin planning, many of the things we're talking about here, municipal stormwater. I handle basically the surface water side of the Central Valley Water Board office work out of Rancho Cordova. I don't know if you want more background on the agency. Sometimes we're the little-known agency, and some people know us far too well. So I'll just really leave it up to whatever questions you want.
Great. Great. Thank you very much. Can you tell us if the cities of Davis and Woodland are required to comply with their wastewater permit by 2016? That's Woodland, and 2017 in the case of Davis.
Yes. There are time schedules that are actually shorter than that for some things. City of Davis has a compliance schedule much shorter than that for selenium. And we actually have out right now on the streets a proposal to extend that time schedule another few years, because you would be in noncompliance and subject to mandatory fines. How long we can grant any discharger to get into compliance depends on the chemical. Some of them are regulated as selenium is under federal regulations, which have a different set of rules and time schedules than something like salt, which the feds don't have a specific number for. So we have more freedom on that. Again, it gets very complicated in terms of which constituent you're talking with, when your permit was adopted, any number of things. But bottom line is you have time schedules. The two, Davis in particular has major upgrades for improved pathogens, reduced oxygen demand, and a number of things by 2017.
Can you tell us a little bit about your role there at the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and especially as it relates to enforcement of the wastewater discharge permits that our two cities have?
For the permits, we actually have a separation of functions between our permit writing and the actual enforcement. And again, in terms of vagueness, that's not like a nice clean line. Permit actions where we're setting limits and setting time schedules that we legally can put in permits clearly is my side of the office, which is Diana implementing that. What we call friendly enforcement actions, like the time schedule order we have now on Davis for selenium, and we're proposing to amend. We're looking at that as a permitting action because that's not hitting the city over the head with a stick or fining them. We have a separate part of our office actually under another assistant executive officer that would be looking at if you have failed to comply with a time schedule, should you be getting a unfriendly cease and desist order? Should we be fining you either a mandatory minimum penalty or discretionary, which can be vastly larger than the mandatory minimums? So I deal with the community in terms of what goes into their permit, and within certain legal constraints, how long the community can have and what's reasonable on that. If the city does not comply with the permit, it goes over to the enforcement side of our office. And I actually literally am not involved in those decisions.
Could you tell us a little bit about the process for approval of extensions and what you meant by a statement that was quoted in the press that a new law allows cities to apply for further extension on their requirements to clean up the water that they discharge?
The new law deals with the mandatory minimum penalties, and let me back up to what that is. Regional boards historically have worked with cities and other dischargers when we felt there were good reasons to grant more time. We did so. In the late 90s, the legislature was looking at what the regional boards had been doing, became unhappy with the number of times we were granting extended compliance schedules and not taking enforcement. So they instituted what we call mandatory minimum penalties. We're basically, and this applies only to NPDES permits, which is surface water discharges, and only to violations of effluent limits. There are other things, and also late reports and a few other things. But it's not everything. And basically, if you have a violation that qualifies for a mandatory penalty, it's $3,000 a violation. The only discretion the regional board has is making the factual determination as to whether you violated it and whether that violation fits the statute. If it does, we assess you the $3,000 per violation. And that can go on, that can be anywhere from a few times a year to tens of thousands of dollars a month, depending on the number of violations and the number, and it's not once per month, it's once per violation. So if you've got 30 different chemical violations during the months, it's 30 times 3,000 for that month. Under that legislation, up until the new law referenced, we could only grant a schedule up to 5 years and protect a city from those mandatory penalties. So if we imposed a new limit, or you had run out of a time schedule in your permit, and you needed more time, the legislature allowed us to grant up to 5 more years of time in an enforcement order without starting to collect mandatory penalties. Now, there are findings we have to make, like it can be done within 5 years. You have a project that will get you to compliance, not that you have no idea what to do. We have to set interim limits and interim schedule dates that you have to comply with. If you don't comply with those interim limits and schedule dates, we start collecting money. So, and there's a lot of things like selenium in the case of Davis and other things where realistically a community can't figure out what the problem is, find the sources, look at the alternatives, design a treatment system, build it, and get it operating in 5 years. Nevertheless, we had, by statute, only 5 years we could grant you. A change in the law that went into effect in January of this year is if you have used up your first 5 years of mandatory minimum protection, if we can make findings that you have a project, you have been diligent during that first 5 years of trying to achieve compliance and a number of other things that go along with that, then we can, at the regional board's discretion, grant you up to an additional 5 years. So again, this is an enforcement action, and it's not a desirable thing to have. It can affect businesses wanting to come into a community that want a nice, clean business environment and to move into. Certainly communities, particularly Davis, likes to have a squeaky clean environmental image. Having cease and desist orders and things for environmental violations usually isn't desirable. And there are larger penalties for violating an enforcement order than violating a permit. But we now have the discretion to grant more time, and as I say, we are doing that with the selenium because the Davis was out of their 5 years. Their selenium correction project won't be online till hopefully 2017. And we would have to start collecting mandatory minimum penalties for selenium violations. If we get this amendment to the time schedule order adopted, then we won't have to start collecting that. So what will happen in 2017, or the different dates for those two cities, if they are not in compliance with the time schedules and their permits, we will look at the facts, whether or not we legally can grant an extension. Well, we can always adopt an enforcement order with a time schedule. Whether or not we can grant mandatory minimum penalty protection with that depends on whether there is a project and you've been diligent in pursuing that project, and frankly, if you've had a project and the city's decided, we're not going to proceed with that one, we're going to start looking for other issues or just postpone it, that is a set of facts that makes it exceedingly difficult for my board to make the necessary findings to grant the protection. And in comments of another part that fits in with this, of the opening statement about, gee, it may be cheaper just to pay the mandatory minimum penalties. The mandatory penalties are just that. They are mandatory, but they are minimum. If a community is not moving forward with a project, even if we gave them protection initially, we can do discretionary fines. And for this type of discharge, that's $10,000 a day plus $10 a gallon for every gallon discharge. So if you have a 10 million gallon a day discharge, that's potentially a fine of around $100 million a day. We don't usually collect $100 million a day fines against the community, but we have a lot of wiggle room. One of the things in the State Water Board enforcement policy is that if we do a discretionary fining action, we must collect at least the amount of money that the city has saved by not complying. If you have just delayed the project, that would presumably be something like the interest rates, the bond savings and things. If you don't have a project at all, it's the whole cost of the compliance project. And that would be multi-millions of dollars. Again, usually by the time we get to that point, the community has come up with a project. But the potential magnitude of fines that go along with a decision to not get into compliance, the potential fines are enormous. And if the regional board decides not to take finding action, under the Clean Water Act, like most federal laws, there's what is called third-party act lawsuits. So your local environmental group, your local ambulance chasing attorney, be it for good or bad reasons, they can file suit in court against the city for failure to comply with their NPDES permit. The judge, while we have $10 a gallon, the judge can assess $25 a gallon and a higher penalty per day. Again, these numbers become astronomical very rapidly, but there is a huge cost. And again, even if you've talked to the regional board and we decide, yeah, you're trying hard, and yes, it is a difficult and expensive problem, there's this whole other venue of the court system that isn't not necessarily as understanding as the regional board, and we're not necessarily known to be completely understanding by all dischargers. We think we're always reasonable, but not everybody agrees with us on our perspective. So there are some huge economic impacts, potential fines if a community is not in compliance. And if the community has intentionally decided to remain in non-compliance, it's a real easy case either before our board usually or in court.
Does this pertain to all constituents?
Anything you have an effluent limit for.
Okay.
Follow-up to that. Have you ever collected on these discretionary fines?
Yes.
In what cities? Could you cite a few that have actually been fined and you've collected them in recent time? And by that I mean, within the last 10 years?
I have difficulty running down the numbers. I know we collected a bunch from West Sacramento a number of years. I haven't been personally involved in most of the fines recently. A lot of the fining action, because of the way the law is, if they're little communities, it's allowed to feed back into the compliance processes. I can look that information up fairly easily. I just don't have a list offhand.
That would be helpful because, Mr. Lando, I have been told by certain members of our community, oh, we would
There's
never.
no risk?
Yeah, and that nobody's ever paid it. And so I'd like to know how much has certain communities been fined and what has been collected, and that would be very helpful information for me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Director Saylor?
Chair Marble, one of the things that interests me, I'm not sure if the media who wrote the article that showed up in the Enterprise is present in the room, and I'm wondering if the message that we're hearing is somehow going to be shared with other people in the community, and how that's going to happen, because this is an extremely significant difference, not just in nuance, but substance from what the public believes is the case now.
Yeah, it's my understanding that that there will be a release of what's being described today for the media, if they're not here present. So help me, this 5-year extension that you're allowed to grant could be granted for any constituent. It's not limited to particular
Correct.
constituents.
Right now, the one we're working on is selenium, because that's the one where our ability to legally put a time schedule for selenium in your permit, in the Davis permit, is expired.
Okay.
Because it's a federal constituent.
And in the case of Woodland, where we're already being fined for selenium violations,
I'm assuming that we have passed that statute. I don't know if, Diana, do you know if there's a thought of a TSO extension for selenium on Woodland?
Yes, in fact, I wanted to clarify
Why don't you come up to
come
the
on
mic?
up so we can hear you.
Diana will straighten me out.
Good afternoon. I'm Diana Messina with the Regional Board Office. I wanted to clarify that the statement Ken made. Currently, we have issued a tentative enforcement order to extend a compliance schedule for selenium for the City of Woodland. It's not for the City of Davis. These two communities are so close together, and we get our permits mixed up really easily. But as we worked with the City of Woodland and the consultants, we did look at the timing for when your proposed project will be completed. And so it was very easy for us to put together tentative findings for our board to make that you are working diligently towards complying with selenium. And so...
So does that mean if we decided that we can take a few more years to do this, or 5 more years, that would impact that kind of decision in a different light? In other words, our intentional delay of our project could impact your decision to grant any extension.
Yes, it's very important, though, that we as staff, when we put out a tentative order, and then our board, when they take an action, can make the finding that the time period is the shortest, most practical time period. So we do look at the interim milestones that you do propose to take and the steps, and is that as short as practicable? And so it's very important we do that, because we know, especially in the recent years, that these orders will, be looked at very seriously by our environmental groups. So if, as you mentioned, that there will be a delay, we do have to have the information in our public record that shows the delay was out of your control.
Okay.
And
Thank
on
you.
that, a recent example of a city, they were moving along, and it turned out there was a giant garter snake issue that had not been foreseen. And it took a couple years to resolve that and then complete CEQA. So, again, we were able to, within the law, not have to start collecting mandatory minimum penalties, as I'm remembering on that, but still, we can still have legal restrictions on how much time we can grant. So where it's reasonable, ultimately by the judgment of our board after hearing from the discharger and the public, we will grant time. Where people have simply decided not to move forward with the project, we legally can't support the findings, and one of the findings we have to make is whatever time we're granting is as short as practicable. And that's both under state and federal law.
Yes. Director Doty?
Thank you very much. Is this on? Oh,
Yes.
okay. 2 questions, I guess. Would you characterize currently the relationship between yourself and your staff and your board, this agency and the 2 cities, as collaborative and cooperative?
Yes.
And the second question is, based on what we've done up to now, pursuing the surface water permit for the agency itself, purchasing summer water rights, going into partnership with RD 2035 for the intake, are those what you would characterize as due diligence to pursue this project?
Okay. In regards to our working relationship with Woodland and Davis, as well as UC Davis, at this point, we've got no problem calling up the staffs and chatting about things. We have worked most recently with Davis through any number of scenarios of getting into compliance, because there's often not one and only one clear way of getting there. In fact, by state law, the Water Board is prohibited from telling you how to get into compliance. We set the discharge. You propose to discharge to a particular river. We tell, at a certain amount, certain times, and we tell you what is allowable. And then you figure out how to do it. If you decide that it's too costly to do that, maybe you want to go to land or move your pipe someplace else. And so there's that negotiation that goes back and forth. And sometimes that goes on for quite a while, and you may decide what you're going to do. And again, the giant garter snake shows up, and you decide, and it literally turns out that that just added an extra several $1 million to your project, and that alternative 2 you had been thinking about that you put aside suddenly starts to look really good. When those things happen, we work with you, and again, we don't always have the ability to grant the schedule changes you'd like or we'd like to make, but if possible, we work with you and to keep projects moving. Regarding the water supply project, that project was actually going on long before the Water Board started any pressure on either of the cities to deal with salinity in their wastewater.
Right.
I actually moved into this area in 1984 and was working with Davis and Woodland on salinity issues at that time, but we weren't dealing with it in terms of effluent limits. We were working on industrial source controls and things, and that's around the time that they were talking about improving the water supply. I lived in Davis for a while. I brought in my bottles of water from work in Sacramento to water my houseplants because of the high boron content was killing the houseplants. So there's nothing new about this issue. And when we started looking at what was needed for salinity at the wastewater treatment plant, the communities already had this project well underway of providing a new and lower salinity water supply, and it was a good fit. So it was a project this community was already doing. Made sense to use that as the compliance project for the wastewater treatment plants. It was a long-term project, so we recognized it would be a decade or so at that point. But we didn't tell you to start looking at reverse osmosis. I think there was a study that looked at some of those things, but I think it was a fairly quick decision, unlike some communities, because you actually have a river nearby with water of good quality. If you are some of the communities down in the San Joaquin Valley with similar wastewater issues, you don't have the same water supply alternatives. In fact, the Water Board recognizes that, and we are starting some basin plan amendment. Basin plan is sort of our regional board set of laws and regulations. It's not just a plan, it is actually regulation. That would allow us to grant some relief from some communities that can't comply because they don't have alternatives, and developing a water supply project where there's no water available is either impossible or at least very lengthy. So we recognize that some communities on salt are in a world of hurt and need more time than we can legally grant them. But that's intended for communities that don't have an option that's feasible, and frankly, there is an option on the table now. So again, there may be other alternatives at the wastewater treatment end to solve this. Those would be single purpose of just the wastewater. They would add a whole lot of costs to the community without providing the water supply quality and water supply reliability. I'm not here to sell this project. I've worked with both communities for a long time, both on the wastewater end, various issues on the water distribution and treatment system, on the diversions from the river, on Conway Wrench water exchanges and various things. A lot of work's gone into this, and so it seemed like a very good project to solve several water issues. And I'd be very sad if it fell apart. But again, the communities do have a choice. Unfortunately, some of those choices, if it involves, you know, a significant delay, will come with a consequence from the Water Board.
You're going to be doing some scoping meetings on salinity. It's my understanding in the future. Do you anticipate that salinity requirements could be reduced for regions such as ours?
We actually have not set specific effluent limits for Davis and Woodland. There are studies in progress on those. There's United Nations and some other studies that say about 700 micromoles of salt. Micromoles is electrical conductivity, and one measurement of salt. And if you're at the 700 level, the water's good enough for essentially all crop uses. Not all crops are grown everywhere, so there's studies that are in progress looking at the soils, the weather, the types of crops grown in the area to allow us on the next permit update to set numbers for Woodland and Davis and UC Davis. But we're probably looking at numbers at best in the 1,000, 1,200 range probably. And Woodland is like 1,700, 1,800. Davis is like, depends on the time of year. It's lower right now because it rained like crazy. But I think our interim limit's like 2,300 or something like that. So it is likely we will again, we don't have a limit, but we will relax away from sort of our default. I cannot picture us being anywhere near the salinity levels that are currently coming out in your wastewater treatment plants.
Say that last sentence again.
If we went in with no studies and we're saying you must be fully protective of any type of crop that is grown with your wastewater, that your wastewater went out and got right onto a crop without dilution or minimal dilution, we would be talking about a number somewhere around 700. The studies that have been done so far, and we need to wrap up before the next permits for the two cities, don't indicate that that low level of 700 is necessary to protect agriculture completely. There is some crop loss at even the levels proposed, and there are going to be some very interesting policy decisions by the Water Board as to how protective we need to be against crop losses from a city's discharge. But I cannot foresee a number in a permit that would allow you to continue to discharge anywhere near the concentrations of salt that you're putting out right now. So a major reduction in salt will be necessary. I'm just not sure at this point exactly what that number is going to be. From the studies that were done before, the water supply project should get you down easily into the range that would be allowable.
So is there a difference, and I'm sorry to ask this, but is there a difference between discharge requirements and effluent requirements?
For what I'm saying right now, yes, they'd be the same.
They would be the same.
Yeah, an effluent limit is a discharge requirement. There are many other discharge requirements other than just what is on your effluent.
Right. And the water supply project is our way of meeting those requirements.
That is the way Davis and Woodland selected to meet those requirements.
Right. So, and it's true that the project got going before we had these requirements,
Correct.
And we were headed down the road of doing this project for water supply, water taste, whatever, aesthetic,
And reliability.
reliability, groundwater overdraft, diminishing quality over time for the groundwater. And then these requirements came along, and then the project became the way that we were going to make sure that we were meeting the requirements.
Correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, that just adds to the case that even if these requirements were to go away, which they're not, obviously there's still a basis for the project. But there is, out there now, very clear noticing by the state board that suggests that there's going to be a change to the requirements, right?
Okay, you're talking about, I'm assuming, the City of Tracy and the Delta standards.
Yeah, I'm talking about the
let me-
delta salinity standards,
Let me
right?
step back to some more background, because basically what you're talking about does not apply to the city of Davis. The State Water Resources Control, most of the water quality objectives that we enforce are either set by the federal government or we set them ourselves as a regional water board. In the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta, the State Water Resources Control Board has what they call the Bay Delta Plan, and that sets salinity among other standards for the protection of aquatic life, drinking water uses, a whole host of things, agricultural supply.
I understand. Okay.
And they have set within that standards in the southern part of the Delta, down near the Tracy area, some salinity standards. And those we used when we adopted the NPDES permits for Tracy and Stockton and Manteca and Mountain House and the communities down there where geographically those standards apply. Superior Court ruled recently that when the State Water Board adopted those standards, they did not comply fully with a part of the water code that applies to adopting of standards. And the specific thing was an economic analysis. So his ruling, first off, only applies to those standards down there, not the ones up here. And those standards are 700 during the irrigation season and 1,000 not in the irrigation season. So they are relooking at those standards, and again, they might adjust them, but again, probably not anywhere near 2,000. Legally, those are a different set of standards adopted in an entirely different manner. The science, we have been working with the State Water Board on the science on the impacts of salinity, and because we're also setting standards on the San Joaquin River, and those scientific protocols for evaluating salinity impacts on agriculture are the same ones that were used by Dr. Grattan, or they're essentially the same, the ones that were used for the UC Davis and Woodland studies. So it's the same science that's being used. The specifics of why we can't apply the standards down in the South Delta, that's a legal issue on the adoption of those standards. Those standards don't apply to Davis to start with. Where you would be using the same science for setting the numbers. What the state board is going to do in terms of granting relief down there, that was one reason the regional water board started a basin plan amendment to grant additional time for communities like Tracy, that their water supply is in part from the same body of water they discharge into. It's barely at the standard now. By the time they add their own salt to it, they're over the standard. It's a very clear standard that they're in violation of, at least till the attorneys get through with it. We were very limited in the amount of time we could give them, and they were going to be in non-compliance. Not yet, but we couldn't give them anywhere near enough time for them to actually get into compliance. They've done a number of things dramatically reducing their salt in their wastewater, but they don't know of a way to get to compliance. And we don't either without going to reverse osmosis or something incredibly expensive with big environmental problems too. So,
And is it your board that's setting the Tracy standards? I mean, it's Central Valley Regional Water
we
Quality
adopt
Control
the
Board?
permit. In the case of Tracy, the salinity standards were set by our parent agency, the State Water Board.
And then you guys adopt
And then
them into
we adopt a permit implementing those. And the court basically suspended our permit as it relates to salt and ordered the state board to go back and redo those standards. Now, when they redo those standards, which I think is supposed to be completed sometime next year, I don't know what those numbers are going to be. They may just complete the economic analysis and come up with very similar numbers.
Okay,
And in regards to the water code, it requires that we consider economics. It's not a cost-benefit balance exactly. And it's not just what is the cost to the community to comply, it's the overall cost, because there's a cost of lost crops. For other constituents, it's the cost of killing fish or aesthetics. People don't want to come down and use the water, which affects
Right.
tourism. It's a global economic analysis, not just the cost to the community.
Okay, but so it just, on these points of clarification that we need to make sure get out to the community, I think a lot of people, and I think in both Davis and Woodland, they do track on the Delta process. I think they do understand we have to have high-quality water into the Delta. The State Board has set high standards for Delta water quality. Those high standards for Delta water quality have included low levels of salinity, right? But just to be perfectly clear, and I don't mean to have this sound like a cross-examination or anything like that.
I'm used to it.
But, well, if you raise your right hand. But then the, and those, those water quality standards for the Delta, I mean, they've also had a dramatic impact on the amount of water that upstream diverters have had to reduce or release downstream to push the salinity, out toward the ocean, right?
Yes,
I mean,
and they're intended to do that.
Yeah. And then kind of in history, I think the regional board has also paid attention to those Delta salinity standards and said, well, but hold on. If you really want to maintain that level of lower salinity in the Delta for aquatic life and so on and so forth, and we've got people discharging into the Delta, we better care about those discharges too.
Correct.
And that's the world that Tracy is in. They're discharging into the Delta at this higher salinity standard that applies to the Delta because of the State Water Resources Control Board, your parent agencies.
Higher as in more strict salinity.
Right,
Yes.
that's right, exactly, thank you. Davis is not within that regulatory regime, is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah, there are two issues we're dealing with in Davis. One is and Woodland.
Yeah,
One
thanks.
is the immediate impacts on the waters you're discharging into. For salt, given that there's no drinking water intakes out there, the thing is going to be really impacts on irrigated agriculture. Seleniums for another one. We've got copper and zincs and other things for fish and other things. But for salinity, the immediate impact that we're concerned about is impacts on irrigated agriculture. We are also concerned on Davis, Woodland, and everybody else about the overall impact on salinity of the Sacramento River and the Delta. Because, as you mentioned, there are Delta salinity standards that affect the releases of water from Folsom, from Oroville, from Shasta, and it's part of how they operate the whole system to maintain those standards so that the water going through the Delta to exporters for in-Delta uses is good enough to be used. If Davis and Woodland discharge high salinity, that increases the salinity concentrations in the Delta, and literally to offset that and still meet standards, fresh water has to be dumped from upstream reservoirs. So and that's the same water in some cases you actually would like to divert. So the saltier your water is going out there, the less water is available for you and everybody else because that water has to be used for flushing and diluting salt in the Delta. Right. So we're looking at that too. Now, in the big picture, Davis and Woodland individually aren't that big in the Delta, but by the time you add up all the NPDES discharges and the stormwater runoff from the communities and irrigated ag, which I also deal with, all of those add a certain increment of salt, and if we can knock those down by feasible increments, it helps everybody, not just on the salt, but it's also part of the water supply issue for the whole state and the availability of water. And not just darn Southern California, but the Bay Area and also.
but, okay, so now I'm getting more confused because
Okay.
we're not subject to and at some point I'll just take this offline, but we're not subject to the state board's salinity requirements for the Delta. So we talked about that, like Tracy is. But we are, as you said, we are regulated for the overall impacts on salinity of the Delta. So the regional board is applying salinity requirements to us because of the Delta.
Because of the Delta, the most critical thing that affects you is the local impacts on irrigated agriculture.
Okay.
We're also concerned about the Delta, and there are actually Delta standards that you impact. It's not the South Delta standards, it's North Delta standards. There's one up, if you know where Emmington is, along the Sacramento River, there's a salinity standard there. We could make you do a study to determine what your impact on that is. The controlling thing for these communities is the local impacts. So as
Okay.
long as we're resolving those, we don't make you do studies all the way out to the Pacific
So
Ocean.
there's nothing in the current Davis discharge requirements that's set because of salinity in the delta,
Correct.
even though you could care about that at some point in the future, in theory.
Well, we care about it now. It's just
Yeah.
not the critical thing for setting your limits.
Got it, got it. The deciding factor for our limits is
The
irrigated
local
agriculture.
thing.
the
And
local
that's not always the case for every community.
Right.
Sometimes the critical thing for setting a limit is farther downstream.
Okay,
But
that's very
for
helpful.
salt here, it's right outside your pipe.
Okay, that's very helpful, and I'll
Okay.
ask any other questions
And
I've
again,
got
this is darn complicated,
Yeah.
so.
Other questions from members of the board?
If I might make another comment that hasn't come up here yet in regards, and this is outside of the water board jurisdiction, but something that should be concerned of. The state of California doesn't have enough water to go around. And by law, if a community is not diligently pursuing use of its water rights, the state water board can take those back. Now, that's something that doesn't happen very often, and certainly for communities where it's recognized that in most cases you get a water right for growth over the next several decades, so it wouldn't make sense to take the water right back if you don't use the water right away because you don't have the need for it yet, but you need it for long-term growth. I don't think that's necessarily the situation here. You have water for right now, and as water becomes more and more not available and there's more and more desire for it, there is, again, a risk if you are not exercising diligence to using that water right you just got. There are going to be other people staring at it as to whether it's reasonable. I mean, you went through a contested hearing at the State Water Resources Control Board. Part of that was environmental issues and delta flow issues, and part of it was other people who wanted that water being available for them. If the city, if this group, cities or whatever, decides, let's going to delay this for 10 years, I'm not part of that decision-making process, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if somebody went back to the state board and said, excuse us, they're not using the water, can we have it? I don't know the chances of the state water board actually doing it, you know, agreeing to that and taking it away. It does happen occasionally, usually under extreme circumstances, but again, if you're looking at risks that go along with delay, that would be one for you to think about.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, I quite recall those hearings, and one of the arguments, I think that got us the water rights, not just the part that had been in the works for so long, but was exactly that, was that it was predicated on the discharge permit that we were being required to meet. That was our way of meeting the federal regulations and state regulations for our wastewater discharge. It wasn't sort of just because we want more water. We had to improve the source water. And I think that was one of the standards that they looked at before they gave us that wastewater permit, or the surface water permit.
Need is part of the allocation decisions by the state board, so I wasn't at the hearings, unfortunately.
It was an interesting process.
All right. We appreciate very much you coming and taking this much time. I think if in summary, maybe you could, I don't know if you can do this or not, but all of us as members of this board, and probably every member of the two city councils that enacted this agency to begin with, are asked frequently by members of the public, this project costs a fortune. We feel that it's too much for us to pay, and certainly too much for us to pay as rapidly as your rate increases are showing that will be required to pay. Consequently, and I just the other day had a prominent member actually of the Davis community come to me and say, in my opinion, you need to call their bluff and just do nothing in your project and cease working towards this project at this point in time. How would you respond to that?
Both Davis and Woodland have real problems with salinity of their wastewater. State and federal law requires us to get you to fix it, or the communities. The water supply project has the advantage of fixing the wastewater problem and providing other benefits to the community in terms of water supply quality and reliability that we've been through before. There are other alternatives to achieving compliance that, as I'm remembering, cost as much or more than the water supply project and only fix the wastewater. In terms of calling our bluff, our board generally isn't all that excited about shutting down communities. There's a point at which, particularly with mandatory penalties and even beyond mandatory penalties, those can't just go on forever, or we will have to take enforcement, stronger enforcement action. We can't just sit aside ourselves and let the Woodland and Davis go on forever. If you come up with another project that takes a year or so longer, we might be fine with that. If you come up with another project that takes 5 or 10 years longer, I doubt it. If you come up with no project at all, we probably won't have any choice but to start ratcheting up the pressure from our side. And I expect that wouldn't start out with a, $50 million fine or anything. We'd have to, look at what's going on and why and what the alternatives are and go through the, it's not an easy thing from our side, to deal with a community that is just deciding not to comply. This is probably not a type of an issue where, as we can in some cases, put a connection ban on a community. Because this isn't a killing fish, it's not a public health, death and destruction type of an issue. So one of our most powerful tools, which is basically to shut down community growth, and just being realistic, just being honest with you, is probably not available. It would be time schedules and fines. And again, how much will we fine the community, over what period of time? I don't know. The potential is there for, buying the cities very quickly, the way the fine structures are set up. But the Water Board has a lot of discretion in terms of the amount, except that we are required by law, by regulation actually, to recover the savings that the communities are enjoying by not complying. And that could be a very enormous minimum amount.
That's a big statement, I think.
That's big, and again, there's that whole Third Party Act lawsuit. Even if we do nothing, there's a lot of activity, and we deal with it all the time on Third Party Act lawsuits against NPDES dischargers. So it's a big risk.
All right.
So.
Thank you very much again for coming and for taking time out of your schedule.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you. Are there any comments from the public on this item? Seeing none, we'll move then forward on the agenda. We have a consent calendar.
Move the consent calendar.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Item 6, correspondence of interest to the board. Eric, do you want to take that item?
Yes, in your packets, you should have a copy of the letter that we received from Reclamation, Bureau of Reclamation, identifying, again, another step taken that gives us greater confidence that there will be funding for the design of 100% design for the joint intake facilities. And just wanted to share that with the board, particularly since on our June 7th board meeting, we gave you the first indication that they intended to do so. This strengthens it a little bit more. They're still saying that it may not occur. I mean, a long shot possibility, and that we are proceeding at our own risk, as is RD 2035. But it strengthens their commitment, and it looks like they would be formally issuing the requisition in mid-July to end of July. And we just wanted to share with you, since that was a particular element in our agreement with RD 2035 in terms of demonstrating that they are indeed going to be getting funding for 100% design services. So.
Very good. Questions? Yeah. We'll be back to Washington again for the next year.
I think it's worth saying congratulations and for the good work that you all did.
I think
We pestered them to death.
it paid dividends, so we'll hope with each succeeding year we can have that continue to move forward. I think it's probably appropriate to state that this board does not have any desire to go to option B. We all are still wanting option A to work and working diligently to make option A work. And I have not sensed any change myself from this board in regards to that. And I see nodding heads. So we'll continue to work towards that partnership as we've done in the past.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Well, not only do I think it's probably our best location, and the partnership with RD 2035 is beneficial to this project, but as a sort of a tree hugger, I'd like to see that intake screened.
All right. Item 7, peer review report. Eric?
Yes, this was an item that was initiated, if I recall correctly, around February, March, where the board requested that the approach taken and the recommendations that were set forth initially through our program management team relative to the treatment processes be looked at by an independent team. And we proceeded, and you approved the selection of Professor Emeritus's George Shablonigas and Ed Schroeder to conduct that review, an overview of the work that had been taking place, particularly with regard to the treatment facilities. And the report has been concluded. It's in your packet as well. Dr. Shablonigas couldn't be here today, but Professor Ed Schroeder is here and is available to give you a quick overview of that report.
Thank you. Welcome.
Is this, just press on this to go ahead or what? Yeah, you can press the down arrow on the keyboard. Oh, the down arrow.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us, and we'll see what we can do here. The couple of things on this first slide, which really doesn't have much except the date is wrong, as you've noticed. But we had initially intended to present something at an earlier meeting, and both of us were out of town, and it just didn't work. Secondly, for those who don't know George, the T is silent, and it's Chabanaglos or Chabanaglos. He accepts either. So, the down one. There we go. We're just going to talk about 6 topics here. Sacramento River water quality, the proposed benchmark system, which was really the main thing in our review. Some impacts on wastewater treatment, some of which have already been talked about today. Possible approaches to alleviating shortfalls, which is sort of outside the purview of our review, but we mentioned it because it was talked about in the reports from your consultants. Our thoughts on the rationale for a DBO, although we've already made a decision that way, and some summary findings. Sacramento River quality, as you already know, is quite good. The principal problems, Owen mentioned that the report by Trussell's Technologies was really quite interesting, the fact that they used at least 5 different locations that would be similar to what would be at the intake structure, several miles up and several miles down, but the water is going to be pretty much the same, and it proved to be that. They also did a very nice job in looking at some of their data and saying, well, we aren't quite sure about whether this is good, and then going to other labs. I think you really have high-quality piece of work in that case, and so that's a very fortunate thing to rely upon. The principal issues they found, the periodic total suspended solids concentration, which is an issue, and periodically high turbidity. Those are clearly aesthetic problems. People don't want to drink gritty water. or water they can't see through. But more importantly, bacteria, other pathogens can hide within those particles and not be affected by the disinfectants that you add to it. And that's, so it's important to get those particles out of there, and with them some of the things, but mostly to make disinfection a good process. The total organic carbon problem relates to production of disinfection byproducts, and that was pretty well explained in the report you got from Trussell Technologies. But particularly chlorine will combine with these things and produce compounds that are carcinogenic. Synthetic organic compounds are another issue that is barely of concern here. They're very low concentrations. All surface waters anywhere have some. If you think about water coming down any river system, people are adding organic compounds. Pills we take, other personal care products. You also have pesticides and herbicides, particularly used around the house. Agricultural herbicides and pesticides are somewhat controlled, but what we use around our homes is much less controlled, and that's become a major problem. So that knowing what those compounds are, even if they are not regulated, is important, and that's a nice piece of the report, I thought. But overall, the quality of the river water is very high. These compounds are not detectable, really, except in very rare conditions. But they have caused some problems. One of them that's caused problems in Sacramento is Valero, which is a rice herbicide, and it causes taste and odors primarily at very low concentrations. And so that affected the recommendation for a benchmark system. The system that's recommended as a benchmark, not necessarily what you would get at the end, but to provide some sort of indication, has a fairly conventional upstream part to remove the suspended solids as they come in, the really settleable materials. And then a somewhat uncommon sedimentation process, well, two steps. Because of the nature of the suspended solids, the high concentrations periodically, it's going to be required under EPA regulations to use what's called enhanced coagulation. It's really just a high enough concentration of chemicals, of coagulants. Ferric chloride was what was recommended to get what's called a sweep flock. If you've shaken up a fairly high suspension of particles, sometimes you'll see a very clear water zone formed, and then the solids settle down. Sometimes in muddy water you see this, and that's exactly what is going to be produced in this enhanced coagulation sedimentation system. And that high concentration of materials will sweep out the small particles, collect them, attach to them, and so on, and they'll settle out, and you get a much clearer effluent. Product water. I do a lot of wastewater work, and so I always think in terms of effluent rather than drinkable product water. The addition also they're recommending of tubes, or not tubes, but a type of settling system that will produce a very much higher quality of product water, much clearer. And those are those, I want to say tubes, and I've forgotten the word I want to use, but that are within the sedimentation tanks. What's coming out of the sedimentation tanks will be so clear that you would say, well, I can drink this anytime. It's going to be a very, very low turbidity water at that point. That's important because, one, you're going to have the ozone. It's recommended to have ozone beyond that, and beyond that you don't want very many particles going into the carbon filters. You don't want to backwash those filters very often because it will produce fines and cause a problem that way. Now the ozonization step that's been recommended in the benchmark system is there for two reasons. One is that when it is used, it won't combine with the organic carbon to produce disinfection byproducts. It's very effective on cryptosporidium and some other pathogens, and for that purpose. And then you have to go into the activated carbon. It'll break down some of the organics partially, and on the organic carbon, one, they'll be more easily absorbed, absorbed onto the activated carbon. Secondly, the partially broken down compounds will be more easily attacked by bacteria that will grow on the carbon. And that's this biological activated carbon that the consultants were talking about. So what is coming off of that stage should be really, really high quality water. And then at that point, you will be able to disinfect with chlorine and send it out to the system. So we think that the benchmark system is really a very nice system for comparison with other alternatives. There are other alternatives that could be used. More commonly, for example, they would have a simpler front-end system in terms of coagulation, sedimentation, and then a sand filter or a sand and anthracite filter, then followed by activated carbon. There are other configurations also. This is pretty unusual to have. So it's innovative in that sense, but it should really work well. And it provides a comparison for other people to come in and say, well, we can do it this way or that way better. And it essentially eliminates some steps in a more conventional system and should save some money in construction as well.
Can we jump in, or how do you?
Yeah, go right ahead, anytime.
Yeah.
Please do.
But so the benchmark system, I mean, to what extent, and this is, I guess, either for Eric or I think it's probably mainly for Eric. I mean, to what extent would we then use that benchmark system in setting the standard for the bidders of the project, such that we would require them to meet the benchmark standard, so that the risk, obviously, of falling, you know, below the benchmark or above, however you want to say it, and not meeting the benchmark, is on the bidders. I mean, are we anticipating then using this really to our advantage in setting a standard for the project?
Yes. You'll hear more about that in our next agenda item.
Okay.
When we'll talk about where we are in that process. But the intent is to set what we feel is a minimum requirement, if you will, as to what we'd like to see achieved. But we're allowing the DBO teams to be innovative and look at how we might achieve that or improve upon that at a lesser cost in terms of a life cycle cost.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure in the next item that I'd seen that we were going to kind of hold them to meeting the benchmark as opposed to just using it in the bidding process, but we'll get there, so I'm sorry. Good.
And the standard that's set is a very high one, particularly for the removal of the organics. I think that when people find out that there are going to be these personal care products, that there's pesticides, herbicides coming down the river, they're going to be quite concerned about that in general. And this will set a standard that's very high. Yeah. Just a word or two about alleviating shortfalls. As you know, the summer period, there isn't necessarily going to be water available from the river, and during the winter, you may not have to need to use all the water that's there. So why not treat the water? You have a treatment plant with the capacity, and take some of that excess water, treat it in the winter, and then store it someplace. A reservoir is expensive. The possible of recharging groundwater is there. It'd be much less expensive than you can pump it back out later. You should be aware that there's, when you put water in the ground, it won't come out quite the same. Now, it won't have the mineral problems that the current water does, because that's occurred over a long, long period of time. The dissolution of minerals is a slow process. So that it should be fairly close to what's put into it, but there's issues that you're going to have to study a little bit. And that's clearly something we don't really know so much about yet. So the potential for mineral pickup is small. Probably it's going to need to be disinfected. You know, right now, the wells in Davis, I know, are disinfected, and that's not going to change.
Ed, excuse me, I think the question, we jumped ahead. You were on another slide. You had just moved to the wastewater impacts. I know that was of interest to a few people. And the question interrupted our flow of thought, so you didn't address this. Oh, go back. I'm sorry. Go back
Okay,
to the wastewater, impacts on the wastewater treatment. Go back again.
okay.
There.
Oh, what
When you switched to that, the question
missed that, didn't
came to me, and then we
Okay,
jumped
yeah.
ahead, so.
Okay, the treatment impacts are nearly all positive. The discussion on total dissolved solids, and that should be total dissolved, not TSS, but TDS, which is a measure of salinity, has been pretty well beaten to the ground, I think, already. And so it's going to address that problem particularly. The fact that selenium and some other constituents that have been found and troublesome will not be there in any quantity are also addressed. At least for Davis, the wastewater has to be nitrified. The new requirements are going to require a nitrified, so conversion of any ammonia in the water to nitrate, essentially oxidized all the way. That's a process that has limitations on the pH of the water. The bacteria that do it can't really survive under a pH of about 6.5. And if the water, when the water which is mildly alkaline now, or the river water is mildly, has some hardness and so on, during the process of adding the chemicals for coagulation, some of the alkalinity or the ability to resist acidification will decrease. The pH will drop some, and it could get down to the point that it needs to have something changed. It's a really simple process to add the alkalinity that's required to maintain for nitrification, but it may have to be done. There's also the question, the same one, about dropping the pH causing corrosion in the system. And in terms of wastewater, if you have a corrosive water, you're going to peel off things like copper, up you go again. Again, that's not a serious problem because you can control it quite easily. But it is there to be considered. So, now I can go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much.
We talked about this, didn't we? Yeah, okay. I think I got all that. And finally, the rationale for the DBO is something I think you're probably already familiar with, the idea that the integration of these three components, the design, the construction, and to an extent the operation, these people working together will provide a more efficient operation, one that is both a better design and will save time in the overall process so you can get it on board faster, and money. This is what's commonly said. The question mark I'll talk about in just a second. Davis and Woodland don't have a history of operating water treatment plants. So to tool up to that, you'd have to bring in staff. It'd be a process that would take a while. It would be expensive, and to be able to bring in a team that has familiarity with operation and has a backup of some sort of a large company that has all the tools to support that operating team seems to me to be a very good advantage. There are several companies, I shouldn't say numerous, but there are several companies available with extensive operating experience. And they have good records and are easily traced to see how they do and so on. And so there's a good chance that way. And that seems a reasonable kind of a thing. The cost savings bother me in a sense because the costs are based often on a preliminary design, which is almost always more than you should be paying. That is that most often you propose something, you give an estimate, which may be based on pretty detailed things, but you don't want to tell a client that it's going to cost a certain amount and then come back later and say, you know, it's like remodeling your house, and so it's better to be a little generous on those things. So that's one reason that I don't feel the cost savings that are usually reported are quite as good as they are. There are lots of other good reasons to go with your DBO process, but one thing that I think that we'd recommend, or I'd recommend, is that some program of determining what the costs are relative to other similar systems be generated as you go along, so that you get an idea of whether this really was a good or the best possible route. And that should be on some kind of a unit cost basis, and check that out. I think you'll find it's okay. This was a good choice, but you ought to know, particularly if you talk about a new contract for operation down the road. So that's a thought. I think I can go on now.
Chairman,
Yes.
Yeah.
Director Saylor?
on the point that you're just raising, are you familiar with any procurement mechanism that tests the price points at milestones? The reason I'm asking this is the point that you just made, having some measure
Yeah.
of relative cost in a design, bid, build approach. The agency would have a comparison a market test
That should
of the
be,
price. Is there are you aware of any mechanism?
I don't. This is not my area. It just seems so obvious to me that this ought to be done.
Mhm.
That, and I'm sure that it can be done fairly easily. Yeah.
Okay.
There aren't a lot of plants out there that are being built right now,
Mhm.
so you don't have a time comparison. And that's one of the things that's going to be interesting, because of most things are coming in under bid, considerably under bid now. So that's, but I
Mhm.
think that can be done, yeah. And I would ask for something to be developed.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that there's that the agency look into some kind of alternative mechanism or shadow costing of some sort to test whether the cost assumptions are valid as you go through the process.
Yeah. Why don't we keep that on your little docket right there, and we'll let staff comment on that as soon as we're done.
Okay, in summary, we feel that the work that's been done has been very professional, that the benchmark system that's produced is innovative. It's one that's going to be challenging, I think, for teams to develop something that's different and better. And will be instrumental in securing a really good process, really good system for the two communities. I think that things have gone well to this point in this area. Yeah.
Very good. Are there other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Stephen, did you have? You're good? Yeah, I was just going to ask, Ed, if this is really a Davis-specific question, then let's, hold it for later. But did you start to look at the mixing question at all, or is that just very clearly outside the scope of this?
What do you mean?
Both communities are going to take this quantity and this quality, and there's going to be some level of mixing with, a limited number of our remaining groundwater wells, and that's going to present challenges. I do think that that's on the community side.
If I was mayor, I'd be concerned about that, yeah.
Yeah.
I noticed in the preliminary design that the way it's structured, the intent is to try to minimize that. There will be people at times who are having a higher TDS concentration in their water than others, and it shouldn't be for long periods, and it isn't uncommon for water agencies to receive complaints periodically about flavor or something like that. I think. But that's going to be something to be worked on a bit, but no.
Yeah, and it's really, that's, I mean, in your view, that's entirely a local issue. It's not related to this core supply that we've got, right?
Not to that point, but it certainly is a concern for people in Davis, I'm sure.
Yeah, okay.
They're paying money and then get this.
Good. Eric, do you and Jim want to respond to Director Saylor's question?
Yes, I'll ask Jim to respond unless he wants to defer it to the procurement phase, but might as well answer it right away.
Jim Yost with West Yost Associates. We're actually compiling a real long list of costs for all the treatment plants that are comparable to this one that have been built in the last 2 or 3 years, so we can make sure we understand where the market is right now and what reasonable prices are. And so we will go through that comparison.
Is there any way to, and that's good, because then we'll have good estimates, and we'll be able to do comparisons with other projects at different times in the past, maybe even some recent ones, but we won't have a direct market test that you would get with a design bid. Is there any mechanism in a DBO process that you could substitute for the milestone market test?
Well, bear in mind, we're going to get 3 proposals, so we're not just going to have one, we're going to have 3.
Okay, fair
So
point.
these will be very competitive. Each of the firms will be spending a tremendous amount of money to get to that point, and obviously they're going to want to win. So we'll have 3 very competitive proposals, and that'll give us a real good test of what the market is.
Okay.
And I wanted to comment a little bit about the question about mixing. We're concerned about that. The degree of concern will vary with the amount of water that we actually bring in and store in aquifer storage and recovery wells. And if we're able to integrate the way we think we're going to do, at least in the city of Woodland, these wells around the city, they'll actually be pulling out water that's not native groundwater. It's actually stored surface water. So that will help alleviate that concern to a great extent. I'm sorry?
Depends if you can use your existing well sites for ASR, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and so in Woodland, it looks like that might be the case.
It looks very positive
Yeah.
For the city of Woodland. Davis, of course, is a different situation than Woodland. Davis has very high-quality deep water wells. And so the concern about mixing that and surface water is not nearly as great. The water quality of those two are relatively close.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I think that,
But we are going to be looking at that.
yeah, I mean, I think that is, it's probably more a Davis issue, but I think that is important that, and I've talked about this outside of this room, that, right, if we're pulling only if we only keep the highest quality wells going, then the delta is, yeah, okay. Yeah.
May I add on the mixing question that we've done extensive modeling in both cities to look at the mixing, how it's going to be accomplished. If there were no deep well or no ASR water, looking at that mixing, we've also done chemical mixing where we brought surface water with our groundwater and done the chemical constituents to look at what the interaction is. So, yeah, we're definitely taking a look at this and giving it a very close, detailed review.
All right. We'll move to the Facilities Procurement Committee report.
I'm going to ask Jerry Gilbert, who's the chair of the Facility Procurement Committee, to give you, excuse me, to give you an update. We had hoped to actually have the draft RFP available for your review today and to move forward, but it has been delayed somewhat, and we'd like to just give you a status update at this point in time. It looks like we would go out with the draft RFP in about the middle or end of August, early September timeframe. And we'll have a chance to present that to you at what I see as an August board meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll try to focus on some of the items, which include some of the cost things you discussed earlier, and how we're going to at least approach those that we haven't talked about before. You've seen this schedule before. As Eric mentioned, the schedule has been delayed about a month, but that's not going to affect the planning that we had for completing the project. It's just this first phase where we had some flexibility anyway. Here's a table of the schedule which shows that fact. This is an outline of the facilities rather than showing the benchmark, but just to comment earlier on the discussion, the benchmark is our idea of a facility that will meet the performance objectives. The key thing, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute, are the performance objectives, not the individual features of the benchmark, because if we were to lay that out as the objective, we will have in fact designed the plant for them, and we want them to compete on design to achieve the performance objectives. It went through all these things. This is a listing of the water quality performance requirements, the key ones. There are others. As Dr. Schroeder said, we focused on trying to set performance requirements. In reality, it's a rather detailed table of complicated numbers and schedule. This just summarizes the key issues. We want to meet all present and known future requirements. We want to minimize the occurrence of disinfection byproducts, and that relates to the removals that Dr. Schroeder talked about in the early part of the treatment process. We want to control internal corrosion on all the facilities, including the distribution facilities of the two cities. We want a strict standard for aesthetics of the water supply so that at all times it's going to be a highly palatable product. And finally, we want to maximize control of what I've called here emerging contaminants. Dr. Schroeder listed those, and the treatment processes in the benchmark will do that. And we're going to be looking to the proposers to give us even additional ideas on how that can be structured. The area, there may be 3 areas that I could mention that we're thinking about flexibility or we're interested in the proposers' ideas. There are many, but 3 I'd like to mention. One of the pipelines, while we have some strong ideas about what the materials ought to be, the sizes are a question in terms of economy. There's a clear well or storage reservoir for the finished water, and there'd be a question as to whether or not we could get a larger clear well for less money. So there's some economies there. And finally, there's the treatment process itself, which would achieve these 5 items and others. But Dr. Trussell, who couldn't be here today, told me to emphasize that the key one among those performance things that drives it is the pre-treatment or first phase of the treatment process where you remove turbidity in solids. That makes the whole thing work well, and we're looking to the proposers of the 3 shortlisted firms that all have excellent capability in treatment process areas to give us their thoughts about how we might do that. Just to give you an idea of what happens if these performance objectives are not met, and this is typical of these projects adapted for our project, you'll notice that there are 6 groups of performance objectives that are listed here, and they get, the first one is the most severe. These are penalties in addition to the fines that might be imposed by a regulatory agency, and it indicates the agency's seriousness about achieving a high level of performance. And you notice on the right, we even have some incentives for certain minimization of undesirable products in the finished water so that there will be an incentive as well as penalties in this system. We also have a set of delivery performance objectives on the quantity of the water. We talked about quality. This is quantity. Scheduled to meet each city's requirements, and there'll be more detailed specifications on those. Damages to reflect the cost impacts on the cities if they have to get substitute supplies or use alternative supplies. Compatible shutdown provisions. The city's distribution systems have to be managed as well as this system so that you can properly maintain it, and we're going to have requirements on that. And finally, routine maintenance to assure long-term project operations, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next item. Now, some of the evaluation factors that we're thinking about, and you'll hear more about this when we get the document finalized, are a major equipment replacement fund, so that the annual, or rather the monthly payments that are requested by the agency, by the contractor, will include items to go into a fund administered by the agency that on a pre-agreed list of replacements for all of the major equipment in the project. We are approaching standby power after discussions of the committee at about 3/4 of the project capacity to balance the wells that would be available in each city in the event of power failure. As a result of discussions before the board, items 3 and 4 have been added as review considerations in the non-cost factors of the RFP. The final group are the cost to non-cost evaluation ratio, and I just want to talk a brief moment about that. The whole idea of a DBO is to get performance, and the performance depends both on the quality of the facilities built and its cost and the related cost, and all of these non-cost factors. How good are the staff? What is the experience of the particular operator? What are their plans for emergency maintenance, et cetera? And so we'll be looking at a variety of those non-cost factors, and we'll also be looking at cost, mainly expressed as net present value, so that you can look at long-term cost, which is one of the great advantages of a DBO. The balance between those two has to be thought out, and that's one of the things we're going to be working on in the next month, to come back with you with a formula, if you will, so that we can put a proper balance between cost and non-cost. Obviously, if there's a big magnitude difference between the proposers, the non-cost factors become less significant than if there's a very small difference. So we have to figure out a logical way to address that. The cost factors mainly be addressed by present worth analysis, but earlier somebody mentioned this issue of cash flow, cost impact on the communities. That is a factor that has already been cranked into one of the ideas, which is that we would expect that the proposers would carry the design cost of this project until construction starts. And that would cause a limited reduction in the early escalation of costs to the cities, and also accomplish a clear compliance with California law on DBOs. Finally, the selection process is being developed. It will involve their review, the shortlist review of the RFP, an initial submittal, interviews, and all of this is an interactive process to get to find three final cost and non-cost based proposals. Glad to answer any questions you have.
Questions? Okay, thank you very much. Sounds like, when does your council recess in Davis? have we already gone through, Eric and Lenan, have we gone through some of those dates that you and I talked about for a board meeting in August with any of the board members here?
No, I haven't sent out an email yet to get everybody's schedule, but I was planning on doing that this next week.
Why don't we see if we can solidify that right now?
Sure.
We were discussing the opportunity on August 18th, so it'd be the 16th or the 18th.
How does the 16th or 18th, Tuesday the 16th or Thursday the 18th of August work for all of you?
I have another meeting scheduled on the 18th, but it's generally 11:30 to 1, so that works better for me because I have to be here.
Okay. Anybody for whom the 18th does not work?
Yeah, actually, I have something that would be hard to move from 4 to 5 on the 18th, and actually probably about 4 to 6 on the 18th. So if we met earlier
Could we meet at 2?
in the afternoon, that'd be fine.
Okay. Are you good? Are you good? So, is 2 o'clock reasonable? Is your meeting at 4 in Davis?
To 4 in Davis, yeah.
So if we started at 1, does that suit you, Marty?
The meeting would be in Davis. Our meeting would be in Davis because it'd be a special meeting.
Okay,
So we'd
but he's
rotate.
on bike, so it takes him a little while to get to his meeting.
It's quicker
So-
by bike and
One,
1 o'clock
parking
would
is
work.
free.
I'll
1
leave
or
at
1:30?
1:30 is better.
Okay.
The other one goes till 1, but I can leave early if I have to.
How does 1:30 work for everybody?
that's fine with me. But
Okay.
are we meeting on July 30?
No, this
No,
would
that's
replace
off.
July.
Okay.
Okay, so we're good, August 18th, 1:30
Okay.
In Davis.
in Davis. Lenan, you'll send us all out a email tomorrow so we can make sure it's on our calendars,
Yes,
please. Thank you.
yes.
Okay. Next, John Woodling is here from the Regional Water Authority. John has been the team leader for the water team going back to Washington, D.C. for the last couple of years. And John, we welcome you and let you kind of tell the board a little about yourself and your past history with the non-mentionable agency and tell us a little bit about the Regional Water
Want to know
Authority.
about me, huh? Well, thanks, Chairman Marble, board members. I'm happy to be here, pleased to be invited, and we'll talk about the Regional Water Authority, and if we need to talk about me, we can do that as well. But Regional Water Authority was formed just about 10 years ago. July of 2011, a few days from now, will be the 10th anniversary. And we currently have 21 water providers as members. And you can see the map here. It's West Sac and Yolo County. Pretty much everybody that's a significant water supplier in Sacramento County, and then most of El Dorado and Placer counties as well. So just started our reach across the river into West Sacramento, and I think that's a good fit with West Sac, and I think it can be a good fit with your agency, because I think as you're moving into this project, Woodland and Davis are no longer kind of isolated groundwater users in their own groundwater basin anymore. You're going to be much more tied to the rest of the world, whether you like it or not. So we have 21 water providers serving about 2 million people. So, you know, this looks like a map of the Balkans, but it's relatively the numbers of people that maybe retail customers of East Bay Mud and San Francisco PUC, two agencies serve. So you can see there's a need for coordination when there's that many people trying to serve water in the same geography. This is a list of the members and associate members. We have cities that are water providers, Sac County Water Agency, a water provider, special districts, water providers, investor-owned utilities, and one mutual water agency. So we have just about every governance structure you could imagine that's part of the organization. And some notable associates. And the associates are agencies that do not provide water. So it provides an avenue to get them involved and coordinate, but they're not water providers, which is a requirement under the JPA. So the Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District, for example, SMUD, which has a major upstream and Folsom Reservoir concerns for hydroelectric power. So a good place to coordinate on water rights issues and those types of issues with SMUD. You can see the mission is pretty broad. Do whatever the members need to better do their job of serving water to the public. And the focus of that has changed some over time, and we'll talk about where we've been and I think where we're heading. If I can, got to use that arrow, not using the number pad. Some of the purposes that RWA serves is first just to provide a forum so that we can actually come together and form the relationships that it takes to collaborate on projects, collaborate on policy. It's a good venue for information sharing. There's a lot of knowledge in the boards and staff of those 21 agencies, and an example of things you were talking about, ASR wells. The city of Roseville probably is as advanced in the Central Valley of California on ASR as anybody, and has been through the kinds of issues, both technical issues, regulatory issues with the regional board that you'll need to face when you go down that road. And that's probably true about a lot of the issues you'll face, that somebody in the region, greater Sacramento region, has been through it, and maybe can not tell you what to do, but can probably tell you what not to do in a lot of cases. Becoming much more important is to have a strong regional voice on external issues, statewide issues. The Delta have a voice in the legislature. Small agencies with 20,000 customers don't carry a lot of weight when they go down to the Capitol. So even the 800-pound gorilla, city of Sacramento, has learned that they can't just go down to the Capitol and get what they need from their representatives. So I think it's becoming more and more important to figure out what our needs are as a region and voice those in a unified way. We provide economies of scale on a lot of projects. The water efficiency program is a good example. A lot of things we buy, the bulk purchases of shower heads and things the agencies give away, we save money. We can do studies. Some of the modeling studies we do, much cheaper to come together and do it once with one consultant than every individual entity trying to do that work. Down at the bottom, partnerships is very important. With the regional magnitude of the organization, it's a much better fit with things like the Metro Chamber on the Cap to Cap trip. And so I've gotten heavily involved in chairing the Chamber's Flood and Water Committee, and also chairing the water team on Cap to Cap. We're pretty closely aligned with NACWA, Northern California Water Association, which really represents all the ag water users in the Sacramento Valley. So it's a good fit with representing most of the urban water suppliers in the Sacramento Valley. SACOG, we're working on some things with SACOG on their Sustainable Communities grant they're working on, but also starting to try to coordinate with them on figuring out what SACOG's role is in water resources issues. So the regional nature of the RWA lends itself to partnerships like that. A lot of the work we do is done through what we call subscription programs, and those are things that may be of interest to just a subset of members, and we set up programs to carry out studies. To the Regional Water Efficiency Program is the best example of a subscription program. So having the JPA in place is an easy way then to spin off and do a project with less than the full membership, or something that's not seen as the core mission of the agency. But we don't need to spend a lot of time developing new MOUs between agencies to carry that work out. So as I said, water efficiency program, we're developing the RWM plan for the American River Basin region under the DWR's requirements. We've come together for a number of state and federal grant programs. So each time we see a grant opportunity we can do as a region, we'll figure out who's interested in getting some of the benefit from that and put together a subscription program to do a grant application. We've done a lot of work on conjunctive use, and the history of the North American groundwater basin that we overlay much of is similar in some ways to what you're doing now. About probably 1998, primarily Sac Suburban Water District started bringing in surface water, water they bought under contract from PCWA, built a pipeline to bring that into the center of the basin, and they had been 100% groundwater users. Well, they were facing declining water levels, they were facing potential for contamination from aerojet. We were realizing that the American River wasn't the barrier we thought it was. So, you know, they over time have brought in and stored in the groundwater basin through in-lieu recharge 150,000 acre-feet of surface water. So, and I think, I mean, there's a very real possibility that there are, through exchanges, there may be a way for Woodland Davis to store water in somebody else's groundwater basin and take that water back through an exchange of surface water in times your rights don't cover. So there's a lot of opportunities that you can think of creatively when you're in that forum and get the benefit of the relationships with people.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I have to leave.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. This was a good presentation, but I have to go.
When I came on to RWA, I came on just about, wow, I think it was three years ago, 2 days ago. And one of the first things I wanted to do was go through a strategic planning process. And because I think I and a lot of the board recognized that our view needed to change some from inward looking, how we could work together in the region, to outward looking, how we could work together to affect things externally. So we came out of that with 4 primary goal areas. One was to increase our involvement and our effort on integrated regional water management planning, help the members both implement projects and seek funding for their projects, inform and educate the members, and inform and educate our public, inform and educate the rest of the state, what this region's about. Because I think some of the treatment we've gotten, I think recently on legislation is a result of some perception problems that we certainly have in the Sacramento region about how we use water, how we're perceived as wasting water, how we're perceived as thinking we can have all we want. So, you know, a lot of education to others about what we're about. And then finally, more involved in advocacy, figuring out what we need from regulatory and legislative process and trying to get it. Just a few examples of some of the things that have been going on just the past 2 years, and I think really it started with the special session in 2009 and the realization that we were way behind the curve in the legislative arena. But since there's been a lot of regulatory and legislative things going on, and really 2 things I think at the heart of what we're trying to protect. One is the water rights of the region, making sure we have that water available to serve the current and future needs. And 2 is making sure we don't pay an inordinate amount to fix the problems of the Delta that's out of proportion to any impact we may have had to cause that. And one of my board members calls this water and wallets. You know, they're after our water and wallets down at the Capitol. And you know, we've been more effective at informing people in the region, but also having a voice that gets listened to. Again, we've worked pretty closely with NACWA. We've worked and formed kind of an ad hoc upstream group of water users that includes RWA, NACWA, East Bay Mud, SFPUC, and all the upstream water rights holders. As I said, we're working to figure out where SACOG fits into the mix on this region's approach to the Delta. We've been very successful in getting grant money from both the state and federal government for the region for a variety of projects, and I think the regional approach sells pretty well to the agencies. So we're on the order of probably $75 million of state and federal money brought in to fund projects in the region, and some of those, the 2007 toilet rebate program. Woodland, City of Woodland and City of Davis actually participated in that. So we've had projects where that's another of the benefits of subscription programs. We can bring in others. We charge a surcharge for participation for non-members. But we can mix and match any program to fit whoever the partners might be. So what's it all cost? Our dues for full members, the water suppliers, are based on the number of connections, and that's capped at 22,000. So above that level, dues don't go up, and those dues are currently about $36,000 a year for a large agency of that size, which is, Woodland and Davis combined are beyond that 22,000 connection level. For associate members, we charge 0.1% of the annual operating budget, and that's capped at $10,000. I think SMUD's operating budget is probably more than $10 million, so they're getting a break at $10,000. And I think your agency is in a unique place right now, because the way our JPA is set up, it's set up to include water suppliers as full members. You clearly have the authority through your JPA formation to be water suppliers. The associate membership is set up to allow membership of agencies that don't deliver water. So you kind of fall into that category now too. So I mean, at least in talking to my my legal counsel, they feel there's a gray area there, and this agency can think about how it wants to participate. Associates don't vote, so they don't they don't really have the same weight on driving the organization and policy matters, but they certainly do get the benefit of the coordination and the involvement. Just a few closing thoughts. I think over the last decade, this RWA has come a long way. I think we have a lot of opportunity in the future, and I think regional coordination and collaboration is even more so the wave of the future in water resources in the state. We've expanded. We started out really focused on the American River Water Forum Agreement, which resolved a lot of issues between the environmental community and water providers on the American. I think we've greatly expanded, taken advantage of that and that spirit of regional planning, but expanded geographically, expanded in the scope of things we do. And I think there's a good mutual benefit between current RWA members and your agency to expand the geographic scope of that strong regional voice, expand that collaboration and information sharing, and really get some benefits for the broader membership to be a larger voice, for Woodland Davis to take advantage of all those benefits that RWA can provide. And be happy to answer any questions.
John, thank you. Do we have questions?
Chairman Marble, what's the timeline you were going to want to put us on for considering this? I mean, this is good information. We're almost to 5, which is when we usually try and wrap.
Well, my recommendation, I wanted to make sure questions were answered, but I thought it would be appropriate to have staff evaluate now from John's presentation and bring a recommendation back to this board in terms of recommending joining, recommending not joining, recommending being an associate, recommending being a full member. I think we really need to have staff look at that for us, and maybe not today, but we could
We could bring it
add-
back. If
bring that
was
back on the.
your desire, then we'd bring it back, I think by August board meeting's fine.
Well, I'm happy to do whatever the pleasure of the board is, but that was going to be my recommendation.
I have a question.
Yes.
How does the agency have a voice on your JPA? Does each agency get one vote, or is it by connection?
Yeah, each agency gets one vote. We have, for the full members, we identify 2 board members, and those are generally a elected official from the agency and a staff person from the agency. But that agency gets one vote. So
Thank
it's
you.
it's not size-based at all. And the investor-owned utilities are technically not members of the JPA because they can't form a joint powers agency. They are technically to the JPA contracting entities, but for purposes of sitting on the board and voting, they have the same role as any other board member.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'd like to just endorse the concept of regional engagement. There's, John's described the recent engagement by SACOG, and that's been that's real. We voted unanimously at the SACOG board to serve as a convener and a partner in the regional activities around the Delta and water issues in general, primarily though on the Delta stuff. And there, it's become quite clear in all of the interactions that Yolo County is having and the region are having with the Delta issues, that we must band together, because 13 arrows individually get broken pretty easily, and all of them bundled together form a formidable object.
Yeah, I just, I want to thank you for the opportunity and just say, in whatever form we collaborate with you as part of the region, whether as members, associates, non-members, I think there's benefit there. And, that I think is what's important. And as I said, I think you're much more tied to the other side of the river now and into the future.
Chairman Marble?
Yes.
I concur that I see merit within a regional structure that we should join as we move along from beginning phases of becoming a provider of water, and that we move to ask staff to come back at our August meeting with an evaluation on joining RWA.
Anybody have difficulty with that?
I would just ask that staff can pay attention to, and it'd be nice to see, in addition to the value of regional cooperation, just some of the trying to quantify a little bit the economic benefits, whether it's the economies of scale in doing certain programs, or it might be participation in grants. Just what a typical member might over a 2 or 3 year period of time do. So if we might find some to use the word benchmark, which has come up here a bit today, kind of what similar members situated to us have done in terms of partnering on grants or this kinds of things, or what our communities have already done in the area of toilets and shower heads and things like that, and how this would bring it together. But Davis is not a member now, and Woodland's not a member, so neither are. So have those, not necessarily a question for now, but have those communities been paying a little bit more to participate in some of your programs that would then go away? But anyhow, I would just commend the staff to at least try to give us some of those things, and then to really think about whether or not our level of participation, what it would be when we're, when we don't have a project yet, because it does kind of feel right to me that when we don't have a project, we are kind of an associate member watching, and then when we really do have a project and we really are delivering and we really are then participating in grants and so on, things might change a little bit. Or maybe we want to participate in grants even more so when we don't have a project. And if that's the case, maybe we do value going up to the higher level membership sooner rather than later. But I guess when we're at what level is interesting to me, and what some of the most quantifiable benefits would be valuable as well. So.
All right.
Good, thank you. I guess we had half a discussion here. I didn't want to taint the discussion. As you all know, I have been and continue to be a very strong proponent in water matters of our being very regionally connected. And John, thank you very much for bringing the presentation to us. Let's move on to item 10, and
Bill, just a point of order. There was a motion, and I don't know if you wanted to act on the motion or see if there's a second, or if it's just going to be consensus direction of staff. I just want to clear
I
up.
think all we need is consensus direction.
That's fine. I just wanted to address the lingering motion. Thank you.
And I think we have that, so we'll look for a proposal in August. I'm not trying to diminish the motion.
I like dangling motions.
Yeah, good.
Staff doesn't.
Yes.
All right, item 10. I guess I won't turn to Eric to to handle this item. Maybe I'll try to handle it a little bit. And Bob was called out of town on an emergency. Bob Clark. Greg, you and Richard may want to chime in, but let me just paint the picture as briefly and quickly as I can. It's now common knowledge that Eric has taken a position in the San Francisco Bay Area that involves a much larger project than this project. And we congratulate Eric on that selection, and are certainly very disappointed and sad that we'll be losing him. As an ad hoc committee, Vice Chair Souza and I have met with staff from Woodland and Davis, and we've discussed at some length, and certainly if there's questions about this, they could emerge now or in the future, but we've discussed at some length a recommendation that we would like the board to consider in terms of the process of hiring a new general manager. And it's become somewhat apparent to the vice chairman and myself, as well as staff, that having a part-time general manager has some deficits to it. And Jim Yost has very unselfishly, I think, in the meeting we just held earlier this week as an ad hoc committee, has agreed that there would be items in his contract with us that could potentially be done by a general manager, a full-time general manager, depending on the experience and background of that general manager, that could potentially make it a zero-sum swap-out kind of thing to go with a full-time general manager. I think both Jim and Greg and Bob feel strongly that a full-time general manager is in the best interest of this agency. Bob has expressed that even if there's some additional cost, that in his opinion it's a necessary step for this agency, especially in terms of the outreach that needs to go on politically in the grant area with the state and with the agencies involved, and in the work that is going to be moving forward in terms of the design, build, operate process. So there's certainly questions about the finer details of that. My suggestion really was in a similar way to how we're doing the DBO, where we're having firms tell us how the the water treatment facility should be built in a economical and proper way, that in a similar way we could perhaps put out in our advertising for this position that we would expect anyone applying for this position to recommend to us how they could be a full-time general manager and produce a cost savings to the agency in the process and benefit to the agency, and look very closely at the West Yost contract and look very closely at some of the other things that are being done by the cities and see how they could bring to the table in applying for the position the benefits of a full-time salary and cost savings on the other end. So I think I probably left something out there. Vice Chair Souza, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, the one that we discussed that would be different is this would be under the auspices of one of the cities, under the actual employment of. And in doing so, the actual advertisement would be done by one of the cities for the position. And the cost would be borne by the agency, but the hiring and the HR work would be done by one of the cities. Very similar to what we do with our financial directors, our technical advisors from the both cities, and our secretary. And that was different from the path that we took before, where it was a pure RFP, or not RFP, but an application to the agency, and it was filled by outside entities that had personnel that they were hiring out to us. This is one that we would have as an agency through the city's control of the individual. And we felt that the other aspect that would probably lend itself for the potential of more applications is that it is a full-time position, and as Dr. Mishi knows, a part-time position has its limitations, and that a full-time position also has the advantage of having at our disposal a person for approximately an extra 1,000 hours a year, which lends itself to many other tasks, and tasks that we kind of identified, simple things like well, I shouldn't say simple, but tasks of convening meetings, which Mr. Yost does right now, and it's not necessary that he and his firm need to do that a full-time general manager could take upon just that task alone. That's just one that we identified just right off the bat. So we saw a potential of no increased cost with the potential of even some decreased cost and the accessibility of an individual for a greater amount of time. And we felt that this was the path as described to us by staff that we would like to recommend to the board as a whole.
Yeah, I don't know if we would need to advertise from the city. That could probably be done from the agency, but certainly the HR component would be handled similar to what we're doing with Lenan, where it would be deemed either Woodland or Davis would take over the HR component and the agency would reimburse. So with that, I think let's see if there's some questions from the board about that.
Just a
Or
comment, I
comments.
think that the idea of having a full-time general manager makes a lot of sense. I think it's appropriate for the kind of the milestone that the agency's at, that as the project gets more and more real, it becomes more necessary. I wouldn't be too concerned. I mean, obviously the fiscal impact of that is important, but I wouldn't be driving just for savings in that, because I think that what you're going to get out of it is worth the added investment.
Joe, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the tasks of a future city manager that might, you know, kind of offload from the consultants, you know, really are I mean, I guess part of what I like about our current system, not to say that it's the one we are going to stay with in perpetuity, is we seem to have a lot of flexibility in the kinds of people we can hire. So when we need, you know, kind of crack PR work, we can outsource for that, and when we, we add these pieces where we don't quite need it. So I'd just be a little, want to make sure when these proposals come in, we're not, hiring a full-time general manager at the full cost of a general manager who's going to do too much work that might be done by other people at a lower cost or a greater level of specialization. So I don't want to kind of lose the nimbleness that I think we have now. Now, if something is being done by, West Yost, and we're paying West Yost rates to do stuff that, really could be done more nimbly by the general manager's office, then I like that. So I think we really want to match jobs with what we want to pay for those jobs. So that would be a thought. I think we do have to look to it. If we bring somebody on full time, and then we're going to take on, total comp for that person, and this agency will then be, presumably paying that to either the city of Woodland or the city of Davis. So we should, factor that in. But I like the overall approach, though, also of, asking outsiders to pitch. People who really know the job and know what it's going to take and are following the DBO, makes sense to me to ask them to come to us with ideas. It seems like a real efficient way to do it. So,
one of the concerns Jim expressed as we met, and you can correct my words, Jim, if I'm wrong, or if I've misheard it, but Jim reflected that certainly he would not want to give up any items out of his contract where the ability of the new person was below the standard. And I think that's similar to what you're saying. And I think we will look very, very carefully at that to make sure that we're not inventing something for someone to do that isn't better done elsewhere.
Well, yeah, and the flip. I don't want to have a general manager, taking over certain tasks from West Yost that you could put a more junior person on as well. I think it goes both ways. So you really have to make sure there's enough work for the higher level general manager person, at their classification. So.
Okay. Any other comments? Staff comments? Greg?
One of the points that we'd like to make is that the general manager position would be an at-will, and it would serve at the pleasure of the board, would give you certainly a reasonable input into the activities. The other thought that we had, that one of the key features of this position, well, first of all, Director Saylor is correct. We've kind of envisioned a three-phase general manager since we got into this, and we are at a milestone, and as much as we are going to miss Dr. Mishi, an opportunity is here to take a look at what the tasks are and exactly what that person is doing, and perhaps make some changes. The full-time position allows us to put a face to the organization in one person. This person that can go out and mix it up with the state and the federal and be that face of the organization. So we thought that this is opportunity for us to sit down and come back to you with a proposal that highlights exactly what it is that we think this general manager is going to do for us, and why we believe that the full-time position would be a benefit, and then present that back to you at our next meeting.
What I'd like to request, I think by way of a motion to this board, is an ad hoc committee was established by this board, and if it would be in the interest of being nimble enough to get these things out and to start the process, if the board would be agreeable to giving us the authority to make sure that we're comfortable with putting out the advertisement for the position, and with those requirements that Greg is talking about, that we just have the authority to do that and then report back at August. And if the board doesn't want us to do that, that's okay too. But I'm just concerned that because we do not have a July meeting and we're waiting till August, Eric's project is moving forward in the Bay Area. We don't know the timing, and sometimes people need a little time to make a change in career themselves. So I would be more comfortable getting this out as soon as we're comfortable, at least as a subcommittee, with the process.
Just to ask Chairman Marble, so are we talking about the ad hoc committee putting together a job description and getting it out and starting to receive applications? Are we talking about the ad hoc committee kind of getting out a request to parties to submit their concepts for how they would fund or put together a full-time general manager position, looking at the West Yost contract and so on? It seems to me are there two ideas here?
Well, yeah, maybe, and I probably, at this point, am not sure how far along that goes. I know there's, Eric has indicated graciously and very clearly that he's not going to abandon us in his new role, but I also know how large his new role is, and he could become involved in that as early as September, and if we are talking up here in August about solidifying the process, we could be way behind the 8 ball. So that's my concern. And
is it a job description then that the ad hoc committee is going to get out, or is it a kind of an RFP?
We currently have a job description. We've gone through the job description and believe that it's adequate for what we need. It covers everything.
Stephen and I have gone through that with staff. I think absent any nuances, and I think it would be appropriate and could easily be done for directors to look at that job description and provide individual input to staff outside of our meetings. Is that correct? Could we do that?
Yes, through the technical committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think the bigger issue is just getting it out there where people can start even applying early. There are some individuals who have, through the grapevine, heard about this possibility and have already expressed some interest. But in terms of getting it out to a sufficient quantity of people in the middle of the summer and getting some people ready to be interviewed, I don't know the best. I frankly don't know the best timing, and
Chairman Marble, if I could just chime in a bit on the process. This hiring situation will be a little bit different from Lenan and Paul because they were existing City of Davis employees and it was a simpler contracting thing. Now it involves, assuming we want to continue working through the City of Davis, which to me makes sense because we've got existing contractual relations and there's an office space that's been established for the general manager at Davis Public Works, so it makes sense. Assuming we do that, then there really needs to be an element of coordination with the City of Davis because this would be a new position, a new hire through the City of Davis and their HR department. Does that new position, for example, need to be authorized by the Davis City Council? I don't know. Some cities require every new position to go to the governing board for authorization. So there does need to be this level of coordination with the I assume the City of Davis. And then
the City of Woodland. I mean, that was undetermined
exactly.
as we discussed
and that's
it.
sort of is a fork in the road decision because that's where when you talk about doing the recruiting and the advertising and the noticing, you need to do it through whatever HR department you're working with because they're going to have their own procedures and forms possibly and requirements that you would want to make sure you're complying with in addition to whatever the agency wanted to have in an advertisement.
Well, I think then it probably is appropriate to hear from you, and Bob's not here, but you and Greg. What do you think? What do you recommend? Greg, I know you and Bob don't want this all falling on your back in September, so what would you recommend the process be, especially in light of Director Cravoza's question?
I think that one way that we could consider this, the job description that we have was the one that was originally created for the position, and like I said, we've reviewed that. I would like to see the if the board is supportive of the full-time position, for us to get together with the ad hoc committee, set up exactly what it is that we are going to be asking for, and get it out on the street, and start getting some applications in to see what's going on. And then when we get to the point where we are going to cut off the applications, then we can bring the process back to the board for selection, how we're going to do the selection. But we do need to get this on the street rapidly. I think Director Souza was talking about this when we met, that it's going to be at least 2 months, if not 3 months, process. And at the speed that this project is going and at this particular juncture, we can't wait. We've got to get this thing moving.
Is your sense that we ought to have an interim meeting of this board? I mean, even if authority is given to go ahead, get it out on the street, you know, in terms of discussing whether we're going to follow the same process. I mean, we had a process before where the ad hoc committee did the interviews, brought back to council a recommendation. I think we could certainly do that again. We could also employ a different mechanism, much like the cities do when we do a recruitment. I felt what we did worked and worked okay, but I'm certainly not opposed to going at it a different way if this board feels a need to be more involved in that end of the process. This will be certainly among the most highly compensated individuals between our two cities, perhaps second only, perhaps only superseded by city managers, so it is a very important type of position.
Joe, to directly answer your question, I think what is of the utmost importance at this point in time is to go out and recruit an individual. The actual review of tasks beyond what the description has laid out and review of West Yost contract, I think, is one of the things that can be done after the hiring. Personally, that's my opinion. I think they look at that and in consultation with West Yost determine what tasks can actually be taken on by that individual that are appropriate. And in the meantime, the method by which we went about hiring Dr. Mishi, I think, is very appropriate. We would review and then come back with a recommendation to the board of an individual or individuals, and if there is further reviews and interviews that board members would want to do, I think that's something we would go and do in addition to our interviews. Either that or leave it to exactly what we did, is we recommended an individual and the board accepted it. And it could be different, but I don't think so. I think we did a thorough job in interviews, and we ended up with a marvelous individual, and I'm just sorry that someone else is snagging him away. You know, otherwise we wouldn't be addressing this at this point in time.
I guess I really resonated with the idea that we make sure that we can make the case that going from part-time to full-time will lower costs because we'll be able to offload from the West Yost contract. So I'm just trying to figure out where in this process that we're about to embark upon that idea continues to be represented. And if it's that we put out the job posting and we receive applications and the ad hoc committee chooses somebody, and then we go look at the West Yost contract to see if it really offers us a savings, then that seems to me we're doing that all the way on the back end. So I guess maybe it's already happened, but I liked that idea, so I just want to see where that is in the process.
Jim? Before Jim talks, I want to make sure that we understand that it may not lower costs. It would be nice to be able to say we could go from a half-time person to a full-time person and get them for less money, but that may be contraindicated to the type of person that we're looking for and the skills tasks that they may have. We've talked about several different ways of looking at how we can offset some of the funds. We are pretty close at looking at going to a full-time with a wash, I don't think it is. I think it's going to be a little bit more. But then you have to consider the value for the dollar that you're getting when you consider you're getting another 1,000 hours of time for the same, for close to the same amount of money that we were doing half-time. So I just want to make sure that we're not sitting there and saying lowering cost is the criteria for hiring the position.
I just wanted to say that I like Director Marble's idea of kind of laying it on these people to come back to us with a proposal. And it seems to me if we give them our budget and we give them our scope of work and basically everyone's scope of work on the project, let's see what they come back to us with. And you know, I wouldn't try and second guess them now. I'd basically
Exactly.
leave it wide open, let them bring their ideas back to us.
Yeah, I think that was really my thinking as we met as a committee, was there's great advantage to, as part of the interview process, having them taken enough time to evaluate the contract, to evaluate our budget, to evaluate all that. That to me, if I'm still doing the interviews, that's going to be a big part of my interview and my evaluation of them in terms of how really well they understand what they've had an opportunity to digest and make some solid suggestions about. One of the things that, I don't want to put words in Stephen's mouth, but I think one of the things that impressed Stephen and I when we interviewed Eric was that he had very carefully dissected budget, plans, a lot of those things, and could speak to them very, very cogently. So I really like the idea of the people being interviewed having to bring to us how they can make this happen at a cost neutral standpoint, what they would recommend doing.
And I think that is within the job description, one of the tasks that I have no problem with. But I actually like Dr. Mishi's ties. That was what impressed me the most.
Okay.
But so, okay, so this...
The real point is that anything that would be a task that would be removed from the West Yost contract would be an amendment to that contract that the board would have to authorize anyway. At least that's my understanding. I may be wrong, Richard, but there are tasks that are defined and being paid for, and they cannot just be given up to the agency. Would there not have to be an amendment to that contract?
Well, there'd be two ways to handle it. One way would be a formal process through an amendment of the contract. You actually take work scope away from West Yost with the understanding a new GM's going to do it. The other way is sometimes these things just happen informally, just because a consultant has a certain scope of work and money attached to that. Oftentimes the consultants don't need or have to do everything, and sometimes you have a cost savings simply because the consultant doesn't need to do the work because someone else is taking care of it.
Okay, thank you.
I personally felt very gratified that Jim would even openly say, yeah, I'm invested enough in making this project happen that I'd be willing to give up parts of the contract if those could be done. And so I think we'll have to work through that. But I, for one, am just anxious that we get going, and whether it's me or another member of the board really wouldn't matter to me. I just think an ad hoc committee does need a little more authority at this point in time to get the process moving, because we're at a juncture that where time is critical in this DBO process.
All right, I would move the ad hoc committee that we've already appointed be formally charged with issuing the job description for our future city manager at 100% time, and that as part of that process, candidates propose how they would structure the workload and tasks of the general manager to maximize or minimize the new costs to the agency, and that when the ad hoc committee brings back to us the recommendation on who to hire, that they lay out for us the specifics on exactly that, the reduction or the sharing or the shuffling of costs related to the overall cost of carrying a general manager.
Second.
Any discussion?
I think
Do I need to ask
I think
for-
it's a great motion. I think people should vote for it.
Do I need to ask for public comment on that, Richard?
Yes, you do.
Any member of the public wish to comment on that item? Seeing none? I thought you were going to the podium there, Don.
That's right.
All right, seeing none, all in favor? Aye, opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
What is, though, if I can ask, what is the salary range that would presumably be on this job description that would go out?
We've looked at about 20 different salaries that are out there. A lot of it'll depend on qualifications, but it's somewhere between 175, no, excuse me, 200,000 and 350,000. We have to look and see where that is.
Total compensation.
Yeah, that's
salary
total.
ranges
That's
were
with
from
including
120 up
benefits.
to 200.
Joe, considerably more than a city manager in the city of Davis or city of Woodland gets paid.
Well, that's dependent on some of the people that we've looked at that are doing this general manager job are total compensation of 180,000. I mean, that's what we have to look at is I mean, I could guarantee you we could fill this position for $75,000 a year, but you're not going to get the person you need that has the skill set that you need. So, a lot of it's going to depend on qualifications.
I mean,
Why don't you distribute to make sure that it gets distributed to each board member, that little spreadsheet that you've done up of compensation of area water managers, which
Right.
is a very informative spreadsheet. It's all public information.
Yeah, they were public works directors and water agency directors throughout the region.
And Chairman Marvel, if I could add to that request too, I think it'd also be helpful to share the existing job description with Director Doty and Provoza, who may not have seen it or may not have seen it in a while at least, and see if they want to take a fresh look at it and pass forward any comments they may have to the technical committee.
Yeah, well, given that level of salary that we're talking about, it just makes all the more important to me to understand, how the shuffling of costs is going to work so that we're not increasing total agency expenditures. I mean, I think this is very significant as the rate question gets rolled out in both communities, and part of the DBO idea here is that this person, the successful DBO firm, is going to be able to operate the project. So, this person will be at will, and I can imagine what some of their tasks are, for a period of time. But, I certainly hope, I'm very circumspect that we're going to carry a full-time general manager at that kind of a salary once the whole project is up and running, and under the management of a DBO firm. I mean, is that the expectation?
I don't know if that's the expectation you're talking about year 2017.
Yeah.
Well, like we said, there's 3 phases to the general manager position, and the actual position requirements will change again when we move into the DBO operations. It'll be right now we need somebody permitting, financial, grants, political, that kind of person in there. Once the project is built, some of those requirements are going to change, and perhaps the person that we have is going to have those skill sets, and if not, then we will have to reevaluate where we are and where we're going to go from there. I will say that the current contract for half-time, I believe, is in the 200,000 range for the half-time position. So.
Okay.
Does that answer all those questions? It might also be appropriate, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, when we did the initial hire, was was Don in your chair at that point? Yeah, okay. So
I'm
this
sorry,
is,
I've seen none of,
I, yeah,
I've seen none of
I
this,
really
so.
believe because of that, it would be highly advantageous for staff to take a little time and meet with Director Cravoza to kind of go over what is more second nature to us because of having gone through the process previously. And Joe always has great input, and he may have some ideas that I think could contribute to the mix, and that could be done directly with staff. And I'd actually request that that meeting be held
We'd be happy
soon.
to do that.
That'd be great.
Would that be
Yeah,
okay?
that'd be wonderful. I'd appreciate it. Great.
Yeah.
Can we wait for when Bob gets back in town and let him
Yeah.
make the connection? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And
Thanks for, hanging with me here.
and we're not saying goodbye to Eric today, so sorry, Eric, you can't go out on the cloud here
Not going
tonight.
out drinking with them right now?
All right, any other items for the board?
Quick comment.
Yes.
Having reviewed all the information that we put out to the public of all the great benefits that the project will have, one that I think we overlook far too much, and we need to present, and I would say present even more so in the city of Davis, because I think we're going to have large questions raised over the next couple months here, is the environmental benefit of getting off the Sacramento River, the largest unscreened intake structure. Those benefits are just underestimated by folks. And that is a large percentage of the cost of the project. It's huge when you think about how many fish are being killed by that facility and have been killed by that facility over all the years, and how we are going to be part of removing it through this project.
Very good. Thank you. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Or I guess I should ask, any other comments from board members before we entertain a motion?
Yeah, I do think we have to be a little careful with that argument, Stephen, because the flip is then Davis ratepayers are paying or subsidizing what a Sacramento River diverter should have been doing for years and years and years and years. So it's potentially, that is one result at the end, but if you're not for the project at all, you're not going to be excited to do a project that takes care of somebody else's ongoing violation. So I think, it is a benefit, but we have to make sure it presents properly.
That's a good comment, but the flip to that comment is that, and it's important, I think, for all of us to know this, because we all get hammered with these questions with increasing frequency. But the flip is that they're being funded 100% by the federal government, not by us. And because it's so important to us to do it with them from a financial standpoint, beneficial to us to help lower, even though it's an incremental lowering, by jointly doing the project with them, we're actually incrementally lowering our ratepayers' rates, and they need to understand how important that partnership is for that reason. And if we can lower rates incrementally and get rid of this largest unscreened structure without our having subsidized it, that's the best of all worlds, and we should all be pushing.
Right.
So I think that's the kind of the comeback.
Yeah, I'm all there with that. Yeah.
Good. Do we need a motion? We're all so tired and hungry that. Second. All in favor? Aye. Okay.